Yeah, I told your age, Joe. Is that okay? All right. Okay, Ray, would you introduce our program, please?
Okay, it's great to see so many people out here for our program today, and we're so lucky to have Bill Kibler from Greenville, South Carolina, and his mother here to see him. Bill, would you come and give your program, please?
Thank you, Ray. Thank you. Wow, what a great crowd, and thank you, and thanks for letting me be here. Ray asked me to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm from Kingsport, was raised here, left Kingsport after graduating from Dobbins Bennett High School in 1974, moved to South Carolina, and I have basically been in South Carolina ever since. To kind of put this in perspective, I'm a non-historian speaking to the Kingsport Historical Society about a town I haven't lived in for 45 years. Okay, great. So the only real credentials that I have for being here are that I lived for 15 years of my life in White City here in Kingsport. That was my own little chapter. And I share another credential with you all, and that is I have a love of history, as you do. And for all of us, I think history allows us to see our own chapters in the bigger picture. And that's what this presentation about White City is about for me. There is a little bit of a debate now about where White City actually is. I don't know because of the light. If you can see the yellow line very well, I'll walk over here. This yellow line delineates our understanding today of White City. That's Yadkin Street and Norwood Street, and as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, that's John Sevier Middle School, to give you a little perspective. My reacquaintance with White City and the history began a couple of years ago when a group of communitarians known as the Delphians were having a meeting in the old Holston Lodge, and they were looking for somebody to come talk to them who lived in White City and tell them about what it was like to grow up there, and so they called on me. And I began to study because I didn't know much about the very neighborhood that I had grown up in. And the more I studied, the more amazed I became as names jumped off the page and took personalities and became real people. I thought J. Fred Johnson built a stadium growing up. Learned a whole lot more about J. Fred in this presentation. I'd like to pause for a second and embarrass somebody who's in the room with us right now. Brianne Wright. Brianne's sitting in the corner there. You probably know Brianne. She is our city archivist, the Kingsport City Archivist, an author, and a historian, is probably qualified to give this presentation more than I am. And so thank you, Brianne. We put that picture up. Also would like to thank, and I don't believe he's here, Vince Staten. Vince, as you know, writes for the Kingsport Times-News, is a wonderful storyteller, and I'm thanking him in advance for not suing me for using some of his pictures in this presentation. Most of my memories about growing up in White City are similar to your memories about growing up in your neighborhood. Times were different. Parents sat on front porches together in the evenings and drank iced tea. Kids played together in the streets. And White City was very much like that. It was a very congenial, communal neighborhood. We also thought we were pretty famous. We thought we had some famous people who lived there, and I think we did. For example, we had the brother of General William Westmoreland, the commander of all forces in Vietnam. His brother lived on White City. We had the parents of George Herbert Walker Bush live in White City for a couple of years. We also had the closest thing we thought to royalty. We had the city manager of Kingsport, Charlie Marsh, living on Yadkin Street. I see a lot of nods around the room from those of you who lived here for a long time. Charlie Marsh was a great city manager, and we were very proud to have him with us. I'll tell you a quick Charlie Marsh story. We had in Kingsport in 1967 a young man returned from service in the Peace Corps in Africa. And he was a resident of Watauga Street. You know, Watauga is a few blocks away from Yadkin Street. And somehow he got back in this country with a baby cheetah, the cat. I don't know how he did it. I don't think he could do that today. But he got some notoriety for that. It was written up in the Kingsport paper, and he would walk it on Watauga Street every day on a leash. As you can imagine, the neighbors on Watauga Street were not altogether happy about having Africa's fastest carnivore living with their children and pets. And so it fell upon Charlie Marsh, our Yadkin Street neighbor, to solve that problem. And he went to the young man and told the young man he had to move the cheetah. The young man's girlfriend lived on Yadkin Street. And so he had this idea, he'd just move it to Yadkin Street, who would know? He moved the cheetah to her house, which happened to be right next door to Charlie Marsh's house. It took a few weeks for this to unravel, and during those weeks, we boys, who were very young, began one of the best summers of our lives. We found out about the cheetah, and we would gather every morning, 5 or 6 of us, and wait for the young lady to come out and walk that cheetah, and we'd follow about 20 yards behind. If we were real quiet and real good, she'd let us come pet it. Eventually, as you can imagine, the cheetah suddenly wasn't there anymore. We asked our parents what happened, and they told us it went to a cheetah farm in Piney Flats. Mom, you told me the same thing when our dachshund bit the mailman. We got over our grief with losing the cheetah when we had Kingsport's most famous beauty queen move to White City. And I expect to see some nods when I mention Vicki Lynn Hurd's name. Vicki Lynn Hurd was Miss Carter County, Miss Tennessee, and the second runner-up in the Miss America pageant. Everyone agreed she should have won. Vicki Lynn got married and moved to single, living alone, to a small garage apartment on the edge of White City. And I'll digress for just a second. I mentioned that she got married. She married a guy named Sam Bartholomew. Sam was a wonderful student, athlete at Dobbins Bennett High School. He received an appointment to West Point. Sam excelled at West Point, was battalion commander there, and captain of the Army football team. He came back, from West Point, became a member of the Special Forces, was an Army Ranger in the 101st Airborne, highly decorated, truly a war hero in the War of Vietnam. Sam came back to Nashville, practiced law, and was a servant of the state of Tennessee and veterans in America ever after. And I only mention Sam because he passed away just a few months ago in Nashville. And he and Vicki Lynn Hurd were married for 52 years. Now, in 1968, we boys knew nothing about Sam. We knew nothing about where he was or Vietnam. All we knew is by our math, we had the third most beautiful woman in America living in our neighborhood. And we did pretty much the same thing with Vicki Lynn that we did with the cheetah. 4 or 5 of us would hide out near Vicki Lynn's apartment and wait for her to come out and do something dramatic like pick up the newspaper or get in her car. To her credit, and I haven't spoken to her obviously since 1968 as a little kid, but to her credit, she always knew we were there and always waved at us, and we always turned and ran when she did. Many of you know a lot about White City. I'm not a professional presenter, and I'm skipping a lot of pictures in my PowerPoint presentation. That's a picture of Vicki Lynn from 1968. She was a very beautiful lady. Many of you know about White City. You know the construction of White City began 100 years ago. 100 years ago this summer, in 1919. You may know the houses there were designed by architect Clinton McKenzie, who designed a lot of buildings in Kingsport, and you may know that the houses were initially required in their deeds to be painted white. I don't know if that still exists, but they were even when I lived there. When I began reading about White City, though, I learned that it was a lot more than just interesting architecture and a mandatory paint color. It was a history that went back long before 1919 when construction began. This history went back to the 1890s and Chicago, believe it or not, and to the imagination of George Lafayette Carter. Several books have been written about George Carter. He was a developer, an entrepreneur, a visionary, a philanthropist, a railroad man, and I dare say the single most important businessman ever in the history of Southwest Virginia and the Tri-Cities area. To put some of his achievements in perspective, George Carter built and developed most of the coal mining towns we know today in the Virginias. He founded the Clinchfield Railroad and a lot of other railroads. He imagined and started the city of Kingsport. He created the Bristol Herald Courier. He founded the college that would become East Tennessee State University, and those are just a few of the things he did. He also got into financial trouble. And interestingly and ironically, his financial trouble may have been the final impetus that led to the creation of White City. George was a master strategist. He knew that coal was money. And to get that money out of the ground, you needed people. And to get people, you needed a town. And once you had the town, to get the coal to market, you needed a railroad. So that's how he came to do so many of those things. And he built most of the coal mines and coal mining towns in Southwest Virginia and Southern West Virginia. This picture here is from Coalwood, West Virginia, a famous George Carter town. If you've ever seen the movie October Sky, you'll know this was the hometown of the Rocket Boys, Homer Hickam, who went on to a NASA scientist and engineer. Before age 40, George Carter was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the South. Yet with all of his success with the coal industry, he wanted to do something bigger. He wanted to build a metropolis that rivaled Atlanta and Memphis and New Orleans. He wanted to build a second Chicago. Okay? Those of you who are students of 19th century history will know that in the early 1890s, Chicago was a third-rate, kind of terrible meatpacking town. Disease-ridden, blood ran in the streets down into Lake Michigan, which was also the drinking water. Cholera was epidemic. Chicago was not a place that people wanted to be. Chicago had a public relations problem, so their city fathers, Chicago city fathers, decided to do something magnanimous. They would host the 1893 World's Fair. Now, the previous World's Fair was in 1887 in Paris. Nobody believed Chicago could top Paris. Paris created a beautiful giant structure at the opening of its World's Fair called the Eiffel Tower. How could Chicago beat that? Chicago did it. They spared no expense. They hired the world's finest architects, designers, visionaries, and landscapers to come put together this World's Fair. They had competition for these people in Asheville, North Carolina, where the Vanderbilt family was building the Biltmore location. And so a lot of the World's Fair creators were also working in Asheville and traveling back and forth between Chicago and Asheville on the train. Chicago pulled it off. The big attraction to the 1893 World's Fair was created by a fellow named Ferris, and it was the first ever Ferris wheel. Those are gondolas. Those aren't little, we used to see at the carnival in Kingsport, but those hold many people, I think like 30 people per gondola. And it was a huge attraction. By the way, in the addition to the Ferris wheel, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair gave us a bunch of other firsts, including Cracker Jacks, Wrigley Spearmint Gum, the Zipper, the dishwasher, spray paint, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, and Aunt Jemima pancake mix. Oh, and one other thing. Does anybody know what the internationally famous World's Fair of 1893 was called? Do you know what it was called? It was called the White City. And there's the White City. George Carter visited the White City in Chicago, and he was deeply impacted by that visit. And if Chicago could turn it around, he could build something new and better in East Tennessee. In his travels back and forth through coal country, he had gone through the Holston Valley and gone through a very sleepy little hamlet on the banks of the Holston called Kingsport. 300 residents in this sleepy little town, but it was surrounded by farmland, very valuable, flat, river bottom farmland. And he determined that this would be the place to build the second Chicago. He employed his development company, which is called the Unica Corporation. Now, I call it Unica. People from the north probably call it Unica. And I don't know how George pronounced it, but the Unica Corporation came down, bought up all that land, and he was in Bristol at that time and moved over to Kingsport. And he brought a guy with him, a young guy who was his wife's little brother, John Frederick Johnson, but everybody called him J. Fred. Okay? J. Fred was also from Hillsville, Virginia. He also brought another guy who was very impressive to George Carter in his coal mining business, and that guy's name was J.W. Dobbins. So George Carter came, bought up all this land, and brought with him J. Fred Johnson and J.W. Dobbins. Now, remember his formula for success. By the way, I have pictures of those guys. That's a much later picture of J. Fred Johnson, and that is a very late in life picture of J.W. Dobbins, who, as you all know, was the first mayor of Kingsport. Back to George's formula for success. How do you build a town? You need jobs to attract people. And if you're going to build a town the size of Chicago, you're going to need a lot of cement. So the very first thing he did was recruit the Clinchfield Portland Cement Company to move their company to Kingsport. And that was actually Kingsport's very first big industry, was the Clinchfield Portland Cement Company. If you have cement, you're probably going to need bricks. There's a lot of brick construction around here, so George traveled up north, went to Pennsylvania, and convinced a brick company, to come down and start the Kingsport brick plant. Okay, make sure that I'm getting my slides correct. Yep, that's the brick plant. With a concrete plan and a brick plan and a dream, he recruited other businesses, built a hotel downtown. The hotel was built by J.W. Dobbins, or run by J.W. Dobbins at first. George and Kingsport needed a bank, so he founded the first bank of Kingsport and needed a bank president, and he made J. Fred Johnson, his brother-in-law, the president of the first bank of Kingsport. He, however, George Carter, stayed active in the bank as chairman of the board. Okay, you with me here? Bank board chair is George Carter, president is J. Fred Johnson. Was George a success? I'd like to read you something from a Tennessee history website. At one time or another, Carter controlled over 350,000 acres of mining land in the Virginias, 10,000 acres in the Kingsport area, 1/4 of the area of present-day Bristol, several hundred acres in Johnson City, including the historic Tree Streets. He controlled the first 120 acres, eventually used for the Normal School of Tennessee, which became East Tennessee State University. Carter's businesses included 12 banks, flour mills, iron mills, coal mines, foundries, railroads, the Bristol Herald Courier, an ocean shipping company, and the necessary dock and pier operations for movement of his coal and lumber. Is that not amazing? But you all know We all know what so often happens to successful entrepreneurs, particularly those who are highly leveraged. I don't know that officially know that George was highly leveraged, meaning using his land for credit, but I suspect he was. Cash flow creates problems, and that's kind of the trouble, the financial trouble that he got into. Remember, J. Fred's president of the bank, George is chairman of the board, and George starts writing checks that cannot be covered by the bank. We're going to talk a lot more about J. Fred Johnson's ethics, but he was known to be a man of very deep convictions. He was profoundly ethical, had very deep values. George Carter started writing checks that bounced, and J. Fred bounced them. He did not honor them at the bank. Now, I kind of got into trying to figure out why J. Fred took such a hard line. And those of us, this is all speculation. I was telling Breanne when I came in here that some elements of this, I'm just trying to connect the dots, and this is one of those elements. Those of us who love financial history know about the banking crash of 1907. I know none of us remember that, but we may remember it from history class. The banking crash of 1907 was indirectly caused by a Tennessee corporation. Okay? Another picture of George Carter. This Tennessee corporation was the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, headquartered in Nashville. And that's a picture of that industry in Nashville. Now, if you think about George Carter's enterprises, and you think about the name of this company, Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad, you can see that they have a lot in common, those enterprises. The difference was the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company was using its coal to make steel, iron and products and steel in Nashville. So this was a hot stock, if you can imagine that. In the 1890s, Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad was one of the hottest stocks in America, one of the best companies in America. It's hard to compare it to Amazon or Apple Computer today, but it was of that level of attention. When Charles Dow and Edward D. Jones created their very famous index, industrial index, the Dow Jones in 1896, the first stock they picked, it was only 12 stocks when it started, is now 30, but the first stock they picked was Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad. Okay? So this was a big deal. In those days, banks could use stocks as collateral much more aggressively than they can today, and a New York brokerage firm / bank had 6 million shares of Tennessee Coal as collateral. They ran out of money, started selling Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad. It started down. That lowered their collateral value. It's a story we saw play out in 1929 again, and the stock plummeted, and banks all over America started to fail. A banking run ensued. Everybody went to the bank to get their money, and it was a collapse. One man stepped forward, a man in Pittsburgh named J.P. Morgan, stepped forward and single-handedly saved our financial system. He injected millions of dollars in cash, and he formed a company to buy Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad called U.S. Steel. Okay? Now, imagine you are J. Fred Johnson, president of a bank, and this is about 5 years after the collapse of 1907, and you saw what leverage had done to our banking system, and all of a sudden your chairman of your board, who also happens to be your brother-in-law, starts writing bad checks. I'm assuming he was pretty highly leveraged. J. Fred probably didn't want to go through again or potentially run the risk of at least a run on his own bank, and he bounced the checks. What did George Carter do when J. Fred bounced his checks? As chairman of the board, he went in and fired the president of the bank. He fired J. Fred Johnson. By the way, I've made a note here that the federal government was so scared about what happened in 1907 that they formed an agency to keep it from ever happening again. It didn't keep it from happening, but that federal agency was called the Federal Reserve Bank. So that was formed in response to all of this. Okay, so George Carter doesn't have cash. He's gotten rid of the president of the bank, but he still doesn't have cash. He's got a problem. He has no liquidity. What did he do? He went to New York. You know, he did a lot of traveling up north. He went to New York and went to some financiers and said, I've got this beautiful bottom land. I've got all of this land in Southwest Virginia. I've got all of these things in Bristol and a place called Johnson City. I need to get rid of this Kingsport property or do something different with it. And so one financier kind of caught his vision of a second Chicago and said, I believe I can help you out. He's a fellow named John B. Dennis. Okay, John B. was a New York financier. John B. knew a guy who owned a company called Blair and Company, Colonel James Blair, who had lots of money. John B. went to Colonel Blair and said, this is a good deal. Colonel Blair gave George Carter the cash and took over, in effect, Kingsport, or that property. We're going to leave George Carter now. We're going to send him over to Johnson City, where he then did more amazing and great things. And through a really amazing financial strategy, got the college that would become East Tennessee State University, and that'd be a good presentation for another day. Okay, so John B. Dennis and J. Fred got together. And how they got together was Colonel Blair said, if I got all this land in Kingsport, somebody's going to have to go down there and look after it. John B. Dennis, you put the deal together. You go down there and take care of this for me. So he did. John B. Dennis came down, moved down to Kingsport. He needed somebody to manage all of this who knew the area, so he hired an out-of-work banker named J. Fred Johnson. Okay? Oh, this, again, I'm getting off track with my PowerPoint. Y'all are very patient. That was a stock certificate from the Tennessee Coal Iron and Railroad Company. Later in life, again, J. Fred Johnson and John B. Dennis together. Together they formed the Kingsport Improvement Company. And the Kingsport Improvement Company was a quasi-for-profit, community-oriented development company, which basically assumed the assets for Colonel Blair. I don't know how well you can see this building, not very well. That is the first building of the Kingsport Development Company. It is still used today, I believe. Brianna, is that right, for the Kingsport, used by the city of Kingsport. There's a plaque outside of it, and I'll read that plaque for you. Architect Clinton McKenzie designed this building, which housed the offices of the Kingsport Improvement Company, John B. Dennis and J. Fred Johnson. Johnson led the efforts to establish Kingsport as a manufacturing town on the Clinchfield Railway line. Kingsport's first Board of Mayor and Alderman meeting was held in the Improvement Building on March 15, 1917. The city's planning and development offices are now located here. Now here's a statistic. Y'all are very patient with my statistic. Here's the statistic. In 1915, which is when the Kingsport Improvement Company was formed by John B. Dennis and J. Fred Johnson, there were still only 900 people living in the city of Kingsport. It was a little town. By 1919, 4 years later, 4 years after the formation of the Kingsport Improvement Company, Kingsport's population had grown from 900 to 10,000. That growth drew national attention. And at that time, the word magic was used around the country. We call it the model city. In those days, people who weren't in Kingsport called it the magic city because of the economic growth. So how did the city fathers do it? How did they create the magic city? These were the nuts and bolts. They didn't trust themselves to just throw together a city. They hired a planner, a Harvard University planner named John Nolan, to put together a master plan. Later in his life, John Nolan said Kingsport was the most successful planned city that he designed. They hired the Rockefeller Foundation to write the city charter and to design the city government. And to my knowledge, that city charter is still used in some form today. They decided to locate industries as much as possible by the Holston River so that prevailing winds from the day would carry dust and debris and smoke away from the residential areas. They realized, and this is a real testimonial to their character, they realized that to have a successful town, they had to have a successful school system. They hired Columbia University to come down and design a public school system for the city of Kingsport. All these connections from the Northeast, John B. Dennis, John Nolan from Harvard, the Rockefellers with the city charter, Columbia University, and I left one guy out, Clinton McKenzie, who was an architect, and a very famous New York municipal architect, and he was kind of the final piece of the dream team. Clinton McKenzie, John Nolan, J.W. Dobbins, the first mayor, J. Fred Johnson, and John B. Dennis got together and decided to fulfill one of George Carter's dreams to build the White City. At that time, to build a model neighborhood. They claimed it would be the greatest housing development in the South, and that made the news as the greatest housing development in the South. Now I'm going to go to another picture of J.W. Dobbins. There's the picture again of Yadkin Street and Norwood Street and White City. Okay, that's what the city of Kingsport still says was White City, but that wasn't their viewpoint. That wasn't their original footprint. This is a newspaper article for the day. Could you grab that light? I appreciate it. This might be, or I don't know which. Thank you. I don't know how well you can see this, but 175 new dwelling houses planned for Kingsport. You can see H.R. Dennis. Now, H.R., there's a lot of nepotism that went on in all of this, and H.R. Dennis was John B.'s little brother. He was put in charge of the construction process. And I don't know if you can make it out, but the second headline says, Improvement Corporation to undertake greatest housing development in the South. 175 homes. I was talking to Bree Ann before the meeting about getting into old newspapers and how much fun that is. I was reading about the Austrians, and they were considering terms of surrender, and I think those terms basically led to World War II. You know, you can get into this stuff and go on forever. At some point, they dropped 175 dwellings to 67, and that basically is how many dwellings they actually built. Now, they did more than Yadkin Street. They considered Myrtle Street White City. And if you're real familiar with that neighborhood, Myrtle Street is one street below. The houses were, when I was growing up, still white, and they were smaller homes, smaller, more affordable homes. Another article from architect Clinton McKenzie, who designed the homes. Okay, this is the early construction of Yadkin Street and White City. Again, this was 100 years ago. This picture was taken 100 years ago in 1919. The Holston Lodge was among the first buildings completed. That's kind of a cockeyed picture of the Holston Lodge. And again, this is from the city archives. But you begin to get a feel of this White City construction. I was kind of amused by the guy with his back to us. What you can't tell is that he is behind unloading a wagon pulled by mules. You'll see that wagon and the mules here in just a second. This is another picture of the lodge. That's the same lodge in the right-hand side. But now you see Myrtle Street down here. That was the additional White City that made up all of those 67 homes. Another shot of Myrtle Street, the Myrtle Street construction. And this is the lodge in modern times. Again, all of this making national news. And the financing of this neighborhood made national news. They did things to sell these houses nobody had done before. And that is, they didn't make a profit on them. Okay, the Kingsport Improvement Company said, we're going to sell these houses at cost. We're going to charge a little for the land so we can pay back Colonel Blair up in New York, but we're not going to charge for the houses. It's almost a habitat similar to today's Habitat for Humanity model. And they wanted all the people, and it goes back to George Carter. To build a town, you got to have people who come, and it went back to that model. The houses had a low down payment required, only 15%. In today's world, sometimes they're a lot lower than that, but in the day, that was considered outrageously low. They offered low interest and optional 8-year financing and 15-year financing. If you read the newspaper articles, they averaged those and said it was 11-year financing, but it was really, you could choose which ones. 15, it sounds short to me. People are buying cars and financing them for 8 years these days. But in the day, that was considered a very long term for a home to be financed. The smaller homes on Myrtle Street sold for $2,750. The monthly payments were on average $18 a month. Okay. Now they did it different. I found this fascinating. They didn't make it $18 a month for 8 years or 15 years the way bankers might do that today. They used a simple interest model that isn't used today. The first payment was $32. The next payment was a little less than $32, and it went down over the period of the mortgage. The final payment was $8, your final monthly payment on your house. I went back in preparing for these remarks and did an inflation adjustment factor on this. These houses were super cheap. In today's inflation-adjusted dollars, the Myrtle Street houses were only $35,000. That's how much it would cost in today's dollars to buy one of those. And if you look at that $32 big payment first monthly check, that's still equivalent of only $400 for your first monthly house payment. So anybody with a job could afford a house, at least on Myrtle Street, and maybe up on Yadkin Street. White city homes were snapped up. While all of this was going on, and H.R. Dennis was building this neighborhood, J. Fred Johnson decided to take a trip north and went to a town of, I call it Rochester, they call it Rochester, New York, and met with another famous George Eastman, and persuaded George Eastman to come down to the banks of the Holston River and build an alcohol distillation plant. And as the cliche says, the rest is history with George Eastman and Eastman. Clinton McKenzie, the architect, made Kingsport his home for much of the rest of his life. He lived in the Lodge for a lot of that period of time. The Lodge, this Lodge, it was the centerpiece of Kingsport. It was the home of all society things that went on. They had dances and galas and dinners and weddings, and if it was happening in Kingsport, it was happening in the Lodge. They had 19 rooms that they rented at the Lodge, and if you stayed in one of those rooms, you were going to be written up in the Kingsport Times in those days. So that was the place to be. Clinton McKenzie, while he was here, designed the schools. Two of the schools I went to Washington Elementary School, and that's Washington Elementary. That was Clinton McKenzie designed school building. I went to what was Kingsport High School, but then became John Sevier Junior High when I was there, and then it's now John Sevier Middle School. It was a Clinton McKenzie designed school, designed while he lived at the Lodge. And now back to the Lodge. The owner of the Holston Lodge, they didn't sell it at first. They hung on to it, they being the Kingsport Improvement Committee. The Kingsport Improvement Committee hired a family to run the Lodge. They were the Mayer family, M-A-Y-E-R, and the Mayer family ran it. The Mayer family was replaced by the McClellan family, and I found a couple of cute newspaper clippings I don't know if you can see those from where you're seated, but this is an ad for the Holston Lodge. The Mayer family left and were replaced as managers, hired by the Kingsport Improvement Company, by the John Sidney, I believe Sidney McClellan, yes, McClellan family, Mrs. J.S. McClellan. That's an ad, and they had opening dinner, Sunday dinners, and the telephone number was 459. I thought that was funny. It was a party line, and when I lived on Yadkin Street, very briefly, we were on a party line with that number. If you can read the top classified ad, it was this letter to Santa Claus from a young man, I guess John Sidney McClellan Jr. Dear Santa Claus, please bring me a little motor car. I'm a very big boy, but I'm only 5 years old, but I was 4. I also want a stocking of good things to eat, signed John Sidney McClellan, Holston Lodge. I just thought that was kind of cute. The Kingsport Improvement Company decided to grow. They built a hotel in downtown Kingsport. That hotel became the center of society briefly, and then a country club was built and took over that role. And so the Kingsport Improvement Company sold the lodge to the Wilkerson family in 1928. The Wilkerson family owned it almost as long as I lived there, and they sold it in 1968. But the Depression hit, and they turned the lodge into a place for really inexpensive housing. In fact, they only charged $1 a night a room, and people who were out of work stayed there, and the lodge took on a very different role in the life of Kingsport. When I lived there and throughout the 60s, Tennessee Eastman Co-op students lived in that lodge. I've put together a few more pictures back to that construction. This house on the far right-hand side, that's this house in the 1940s, and this house in today's world. Going back to that same picture, the big house framed in right there is this house. Look at this house. This to me was very interesting, and I didn't really think about this until a couple of days ago. You see the lodge back in the back of the picture on the right-hand side. This house was a mini lodge built to resemble the lodge. It was just smaller, but the construction and the architectural design are identical. This was the house that belonged to the Westmoreland family, and that's what it looks like in today's world. That is the story of White City. When I come to Kingsport, and I come often to visit my mom, I like to drive through there and remember my own childhood there. And many of you, I found out, greeting and getting to meet you, coming in the door, many of you also lived in White City and have your own special memories of that time. And I invite you, and I think it'd be a great fun thing to do, to ride around that big circle up there one more time and look at these houses that have their own history, but really embody the history of Kingsport. And I'm going to end this with one final slide, and it's really random. When you look at it, you may say, why did he even put this in there? But I put it in here to remind us there are still mysteries from that day, and it's also a classified ad. Lost between Kingsport Improvement Office and White City, a cream-colored rubber-tired wire wheel for a baby carriage. Returned to Time's office, and I saw that and I started thinking, there's got to be a story there. I'll stop talking now. Y'all have been just a wonderful crowd and a great audience, and thank you so much for allowing me to kind of get involved in this and come up and have this time with you. Does anybody have stories that they want to tell, or memories they want to share, or things that they can think of that would be good to talk about White City? Hearing none?
Another famous person from White City would be Selma Sugar Roosevelt, who lived in a house there, and she became President Reagan's chief of protocol for 8 years. She's written a wonderful book called The Gatekeeper, but another famous person.
Familiar with her and familiar with the book? I had no idea. Thank
Yes,
you.
because my husband lived there, and they used to go and ring their doorbell and run off.
That does sound familiar. Interesting. I should have known that. That's very interesting.
Remember when President Bush played horseshoes on the circle?
All right. President Bush visited White City when he was campaigning way back when. Visited his parents' house.
Let's don't forget another famous Kingsport person, and Jitney Blankenbeckler. He lived there the whole time, lived right across the street from Alec Anderson, and Joyce was his daughter, and Joyce and Alec Anderson were my first friends I remember when I was about 4 years old. We could all tell stories. By the way, I would like to ask this while you're, how many people either live there or their relatives live there? I'd just like to see the hands go up. Yeah, and I even thought there might be more than that. Excuse me.
Thank you again.
That was really great, really informative. Some of that we'd heard in pieces, but not consolidated like that in a way that it really brought everything home to us, and really thank you for that. By the way, that cheetah was owned by Greg Smith Jr., whose father did live, or family did live in White City too, and John Hale's brother-in-law.
Also, I want to say that Charles Marsh's son, Ken, has just visited Australia and visited the cheetah owner, Greg Smith, who now lives in Perth, Australia.
How about that? These things just go on and on, don't they? All right. Well, does anybody else want to add anything? Well, thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much again. And let's give Bill one more. Our next meeting will be I think it's the 5th, first Monday in August, and our own member, Jerry Fritz, is going to do a program on the historical markers in this area of Tennessee. And if he has it ready, if not, we'll find somebody to replace him. Thanks everybody for coming.